History is more than just dates and names in dusty books. It's a shadow stretching across time, full of secrets, tragedies, and whispers that refuse to die. This is Morbid History with Thomas Gloom. Chicago, 1904. The scent of blood hung thick in the air, clinging to the clothes and skin of every man inside the slaughterhouse. Arthur wiped the sweat from his brow with a grease-stained rag, then turned back to the assembly line of carcasses. The smell of the place used to overwhelm him, make his stomach churn constantly. But he'd gotten used to it over time. Maybe gotten used to it wasn't the best description, because to him it was as if the reek of blood and guts had completely eaten away his sense of smell. It was almost time for him to head on home for a meal with his family, and then a few hours of sleep before it was back to this wretched place again. Arthur tried not to think about the rat he saw earlier, slipping between sausage links. He tried even harder to forget the man who'd fallen into the rendering vat last week. There was no shutdown, just more cans. At long last, the whistle sounded, and Arthur clocked out with a hollow stomach and picked up a tin labeled potted beef. He didn't need to check the label. He knew where it came from and what other mystery meats it contained. He also knew he'd eat it anyway and not mention a word to his family. This was life, and he assumed it would never change. In 1906, a single novel struck such fear and disgust into the American public that it not only changed the way people thought about their food, it reshaped an entire industry. The book was entitled The Jungle, and its author, Upton Sinclair, likely had no idea just how far his words would ripple. Here's an excerpt. Quote, "There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it." Unquote. Sinclair's goal wasn't to gross people out, at least not at first. He was a muckraker, a type of investigative journalist in the early 20th century who specialized in exposing societal rot. With The Jungle, he wanted to shine a light on the horrific conditions faced by immigrant laborers working in the meatpacking plants of Chicago's stockyards. Backbreaking hours, unsafe conditions, exploitation, and utter dehumanization. But the public didn't zero in on the labor issues. No, what shocked readers most were the other details. Descriptions of how their sausages, canned meats, and potted beef were made. This eventually led to a federal investigation, which we will look at more closely momentarily. But for now, here's what one investigator wrote. Quote, "The stench in some rooms was overwhelming. We found barrels of meat labeled condemned, and in the next room, those same barrels were being relabeled as approved." Unquote. You see, people had been enjoying processed meats for years without asking too many questions. But Sinclair pulled back the curtain, and what he revealed was closer to horror fiction than investigative journalism. He described vats of rotting meat being doused in chemicals to disguise the stench. It was then ground up and sold as fresh. He spoke of floors covered in rat droppings, where rodents were often swept up into the grinders along with the meat. In some cases, dead rats weren't removed. They were simply processed with the meat. Even more disturbing, sometimes it wasn't just rats. There were whispers, unconfirmed but persistent, of workers falling into the enormous rendering vats. Their bodies weren't retrieved. The machinery didn't stop. What went in came out as canned goods. Sinclair famously said, quote, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident, I hit it in the stomach," unquote. The outrage wasn't over the plight of the workers. It was over the possibility that a piece of their dinner might contain human remains. Let that settle in. Chicago's meatpacking industry was a massive operation in the early 1900s. The city was known as the hog butcher for the world, and its Union stockyards were legendary. Not just for their scale, but for the sheer speed and efficiency with which they turned living creatures into commodities. The industry was largely unregulated. There were no federal food safety standards, no oversight, and no consequences, until the jungle forced the nation to look and gag. The public response was immediate and visceral. People wrote to Congress demanding reform. One consumer wrote the following to Congress, which I paraphrase here. Quote, "After reading what's in these cans, I threw out every tin in my pantry. I'd rather starve than eat human soup." Unquote. Newspapers ran serialized excerpts from the jungle, each more stomach-turning than the last. Even President Theodore Roosevelt got involved. At first, Roosevelt was skeptical. He suspected Sinclair of being a sensationalist, maybe even a socialist with an agenda. But when Roosevelt sent federal inspectors to investigate Chicago's meatpacking plants, what they found was worse than what Sinclair had described. In one report, inspectors noted that meat was stored in rat-infested rooms and was crawling with maggots before being shipped across the country. One particularly infamous anecdote involved spoiled meat being soaked in vinegar and spices to mask the stench, then repackaged as fresh sausage. Workers who were sick or injured continued to handle the meat. And speaking of the workers, one of the most astounding common occurrences plagued those who were assigned to the pickle room. Pickling meats and sausage was fashionable during the time before freezers became widespread. The pickle room workers would develop a very nasty infection from constantly handling cold meat with their bare hands. The medical term was called dermatoconiosis. The workers, however, gave the infection a more apt name: pickled hands. The idea of a person's hands actually becoming pickled is, to me, absolutely stomach-churning. After the skin turned red, it then hardened and cracked. The flesh would split open, sometimes all the way to the bone. Horrible sores would arise on the workers' palms and the back of their hands. It would take at least 2 months or more to heal. And that was if they were allowed to work in another department, so the infection could actually heal. Some infected workers just continued handling and contaminating the meat, despite their disgusting malady. And again, these weren't isolated incidents. They were standard practice. Public outcry culminated in the passage of the Meat Inspection Act of 1906, alongside the Pure Food and Drug Act, the foundational legislation that would eventually lead to the creation of the FDA. But here's where it gets creepier. The jungle was fictional. The characters, the plot, the protagonist's tragic journey, they were all fabricated. Yet, it sounded a very real alarm. President Roosevelt wrote the following in a letter to a friend. Quote, "The Jungle is one of the most infamously misleading books ever written, but it is chiefly fiction, and yet it may lead to very real reform." Unquote. The Jungle, with its blend of fiction and fact, created a kind of psychological dissonance. Readers didn't know where the made-up horror ended and the true horror began. And that ambiguity made it even more terrifying. Because if any of it could be real, what else was being hidden from the general public? Imagine being a mother in 1906, feeding your children canned beef stew, only to read that the stew meat could contain sawdust, spoiled organs, or worse. Imagine working-class immigrants reading Sinclair's vivid descriptions of their own lives, their own suffering, reduced to background noise in the public's outrage over food contamination. The novel exposed more than a corrupt system. It revealed the public's misplaced priorities. In Sinclair's view, America wasn't just diseased. It was numb. And maybe that's the scariest part. The idea that such horrendous and distasteful things can be happening right in front of us. And we only react when we taste it in our mouths. Even today, echoes of the jungle remain. Every food recall, every contaminated spinach scare, every shady meatpacking plant headline owes a debt to Sinclair's work. But maybe the most haunting legacy is this. Sinclair didn't invent a monster. He simply described one we were already feeding. Sinclair's novel may have sparked reform, but history shows us that food and medicine have always had a dark side. Whether by mistake, ignorance, or malicious intent, people have consumed death in many ways, often hidden in something meant to nourish or heal. Let's look at a few times when what we ate, or what we were given, turned deadly. The methanol wine poisonings, 1986, Italy. In an effort to strengthen cheap table wine, some Italian producers added methanol, a toxic alcohol. Over 20 people died, and dozens more were left permanently blind or with lasting brain damage. The scandal rocked Italy's wine industry, triggering stricter regulations. The cyanide-laced Halloween candy panic, 1970s through the 80s. United States of America. Urban legend? Not quite. In 1974, a Texas father poisoned his own son's Halloween candy with cyanide. Media frenzy led to widespread panic and tampering myths that persist today. The razor blade in the apple hysteria was born from this national panic. The ergot poisoning of, please excuse my French, Pont Saint-Esprit, 1951, France. A small French town fell victim to a mysterious outbreak. Hundreds experienced hallucinations, seizures, and even death. The culprit? Bread, contaminated with ergot mold, a hallucinogenic fungus that Albert Hofmann synthesized into the drug we know today as LSD. In these days before Timothy Leary and the Summer of Love, locals believed they were cursed or simply going insane. The Poison Squad, 1902, United States of America. In a bizarre government experiment, volunteers willingly consumed food laced with chemicals to test their safety. Led by Dr. Harvey Wiley, the squad dined on meals spiked with borax, formaldehyde, and more. Their suffering paved the way for the formation of the FDA. And, miraculously, none of the participants died or suffered any long-term effects. The 1858 Bradford Sweets poisoning, United Kingdom. Peppermint candies sold by a local shopkeeper killed over 20 people and sickened more than 200. The sweets had been accidentally mixed with arsenic instead of sugar. The tragedy revealed the dangers of unregulated food production. The Chicago Tylenol murders, 1982. 7 people died after taking Tylenol capsules laced with cyanide. The killer was never caught, but the case led to tamper-proof packaging becoming standard. A chilling reminder that danger can come even in the most trusted form. In the quiet hum of an English office, coworkers gathered around a steaming kettle each morning. Tea was a ritual, a moment of calm before the day's grind. No one suspected that something sinister was swirling in their cups. Graham Young, a bespectacled man with a soft voice and a peculiar air, didn't stand out much. He was neat, unassuming, smart. He loved chemistry, and maybe a little too much. And beneath his calm demeanor was an obsession so potent it would take lives, twist justice, and send ripples of fear through an entire country. He became known as the Teacup Poisoner. But to better understand the true horror of Graham Young's crimes, we should go back to the beginning. Before The Office, before the headlines, back to when Graham was just a boy. From a young age, he was fascinated with poisons. Most kids collect bugs or comic books. Graham collected knowledge, and specifically, knowledge of toxins. By the age of 14, he was already experimenting on his own family. His stepmother, Molly, began suffering from nausea, vomiting, and mysterious hair loss. Doctors were baffled. It wasn't until she collapsed and died In 1962, that suspicions arose. Graham's sister and father had also experienced unusual symptoms, but no one imagined that the shy teenage boy in the house was conducting a deadly experiment in plain sight. Graham had been slipping antimony and thallium, two highly toxic substances, into the family's food and drinks. He even kept a diary of dosages and symptoms, like a mad scientist, tracking their agony with cold precision. He was arrested and institutionalized at the age of 14. His sister had this to say to the arresting officers, quote, "Even as a boy, he spoke of poisons. He would smile when he explained how they worked. I thought it was just a phase." Unquote. While confined in Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility for the criminally insane, Graham didn't reform. He practiced and honed his dastardly craft. Staff later admitted he was a model patient, calm, compliant, intellectually curious. He earned privileges, but behind his polite demeanor, the obsession only deepened. He read medical textbooks, studied chemical compounds, and reportedly befriended another inmate convicted of cannibalism. One nurse remembered that Graham expressed disappointment in not having had the chance to use curare, a rare paralytic poison. After nearly a decade in Broadmoor, doctors believed he had been rehabilitated. At 23 years old, Graham Young was released back into an unsuspecting world. He secured a job at John Hadland Laboratories, a photo supply company in Hertfordshire. It didn't take long before employees began falling mysteriously ill. It started small: stomach cramps, dizziness, tingling in the extremities. Some brushed it off as stress or a stomach bug. But soon, one man collapsed and died. Another followed, then a third. Each time, symptoms mimicked neurological disorders or cardiac failure. And all the while, Graham remained oddly curious about their conditions. He wasn't just poisoning them. He was studying them. His coworkers were nothing more than lab rats to his twisted mind. He frequently asked about their symptoms, proposed possible diagnoses, and even suggested what poisons might have caused such reactions. All of this was done with an almost gleeful arrogance, like a magician desperate for his audience to guess the trick. One of his co-workers described it all in this way, quote, "It was the tea. We all drank it. I stopped after it began to taste off, metallic almost. That's when I started watching him." Unquote. Another remembered that Graham always insisted on preparing the drinks. And so now, in the workplace, suspicion brewed. Eventually, the pattern became undeniable. Graham was arrested again, and this time, the evidence was damning. Police found his journal, detailing every dose, every symptom, every dying breath. He'd written about wanting to see someone, quote, "writhing in agony," unquote. A cold fantasy scrawled in his precise handwriting. During the trial, it became clear that Graham Young was more than just disturbed. He was a calculated predator. He admitted to his crimes without remorse, and even went on to critique the court's understanding of toxicology. In 1972, he was sentenced to life in prison. The presiding judge said this to Graham, quote, "Yours is a cruelty of intellect. You murdered not in rage or impulse, but in calm calculation. That makes it all the more horrifying." Unquote. When asked if he regretted what he'd done, Graham's answer was chilling. Quote, "Regret implies remorse. I have none." Unquote. He died in 1990, at the age of 42, alone in his cell. The official cause was a heart attack, though some speculated that he had, in the end, poisoned himself. The legacy of Graham Young is a disturbing blend of intellect and evil. A man given completely to curiosity, who treated the act of poisoning not as murder, but as an experiment. His victims weren't enemies. They were data points. Perhaps the most unsettling part is how ordinary it all seemed. A sip of tea, a quick chat in the break room, a shared biscuit, and behind it, a killer in a sweater vest. Young weaponized the mundane, proving that the most horrifying predators don't always lurk in alleys or shadows. They sit beside us, smile politely, and ask how we take our tea. What is more ordinary than a meal? A slice of bread, a cup of wine, a spot of tea. And yet, time and again, the mundane has masked the monstrous. Whether it's canned meat laced with mystery, candy hiding cyanide, or tea spiked with death, these stories remind us of a chilling truth. Sometimes, what we consume consumes us. What is it about these particular stories that freak us out the most? Is it the thought that someone who is serving you your favorite dish could have slipped something less than nutritious into it without your knowledge? Is it the truth that just because something comes in a nice-looking package with a label doesn't necessarily mean it's safe to consume? From Sinclair's shocking expose to poisoned candy bowls and murderous cups of tea, history has a dark appetite. One that doesn't just satisfy curiosity, it unsettles it. Food comforts, medicine heals, but as we've heard from the stories in today's episode, both food and medicine can deceive. So the next time you reach for a snack, think twice. And if something tastes a little off, maybe don't finish it. And that, dear listeners, wraps up this second episode of Morbid History. I'm your host, Thomas Gloom, and I hope to meet with you again soon, as together we uncover other secrets, tragedies, and whispers from humanity's storied past. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating, a review, and comment on your favorite part of the show. It helps feed the algorithm and puts me in front of a wider audience. And to stay up to date with the morbid history happenings, and even get some short history tidbits, follow me on Instagram at Morbid History Pod. And with that, I simply say goodbye for now. For now translates to May 28th. That's when the next Morbid Morsel will be dropping. It's entitled The Man Who Sold the Dead. Stay curious. And remember, history can be a lot of things, including Morbid.